לאמצע. Okay. So I appreciate everyone that did not have class and will stay with us, and I think it's all for your benefit because you're about to hear what I think is going to be a very exciting lecture. So this next talk is going to be about self-determination for persons with intellectual and developmental disabilities. Myself also working in the intellectual disability field, and as we said, we started to say a bit in Tim's talk, how self-determination is such an important issue coming up on the rise here in Israel. So I think it would be very important for us to focus on this. We're going to be having two speakers speak together, Dr. Bryan Aybri and Dr. Rnata, both of them from the Institute on Community Integration at the University of Minnesota. And it's lucky for us that they had the time to come because from here they're flying straight off to give other talks in Armenia. So we got them for today. Bryan is the coordinator of school-age services at the Institute of Community Integration and adjunct faculty member at the Institute of Child Development and School Psychology Programs at the University of Minnesota. And Rnata, who has received her doctorate degree from the University of Minnesota in educational psychology with emphasis in special evaluation program. She works as a research associate at the Institute of Community Integration, at the University of Minnesota, and of course I'll let both of you add as much detail as you want onto that. Thank you very much for coming.
Well, thank you. We really appreciate the opportunity to speak with you this afternoon about something which is near and dear to, I think, both of our hearts, and that is thinking about and developing ways to support the self-determination of individuals of all ages with intellectual and developmental disabilities. Before I start, let me tell you a little bit about where we're from. At the University of Minnesota, we have an institute called the Institute on Community Integration. It is a center similar to the center that you've just established here at your university, but we've been around a little bit longer, since 1985. So the center, which started out focusing solely on children and adults with intellectual disabilities, has grown over the years. So currently, we are doing applied research, policy work, training and technical assistance on literally all areas of disability. And it ranges from preschool-age children to our adult population to people with intellectual and developmental and other disabilities who are now reaching retirement age and are really thinking about how they're going to live, the last 20, 30 years of their lives. Rnata and I also are part of a relatively recent development, and it's a center within our institute called the Global Resource Center on Inclusive Education. We have been doing a lot of work internationally over the last 3 to 5 years, trying to promote and support inclusive education in a number of countries, including the Russian Federation, India, Ukraine, Kazakhstan, what am I forgetting, Rnata? Armenia, and Costa Rica, and several other countries whose names right now I forget. We are always willing and interested in talking to people about inclusive education, and if you have any questions about that area, which unfortunately we were not going to have time to cover today, we would be more than willing to speak to you about them. So getting back to the topic of self-determination, what we'd like to do this afternoon is first talk to you about what we mean by self-determination, because I think our definition and our understanding of it is a little bit different than many of our colleagues in the United States and internationally. Number two, we'd like to talk about why it's important. How does it make a difference in the lives of people with disabilities? 3, we want to talk about how we have worked to try to understand the experience of self-determination among persons with disabilities. How do we know whether somebody is exercising self-determination in their life? And then we'll talk about some programs that we've developed that are in the process of trying to evaluate that focus on working with people who support individuals with disabilities and family members of persons with disabilities to help them learn strategies, help them develop ways to kind of on an individual basis better support the self-determination of the persons and their families with disabilities or the persons they serve. I mean, we'll start this whole notion with the idea that all people have the right to self-determination. And we'll talk about kind of the philosophical underpinnings of that. How it relates to quality of life. Something that Tim mentioned this morning about his son is that, you know, one of the most important things to him is friends and friendships. And when our colleague Bob Shalak from the University of Nebraska, Omaha, does his quality of life research, the two things that come up again and again as the most important outcomes for persons with disabilities include social relationships, having friendships, and self-determination, having control over their lives, which is why we have spent the last 25 years or so doing research in this area. The last thing I'd like to say before we start kind of our formal presentation is that both in the United States and other countries, when we talk about self-determination, we need to think about applying it not just to persons with disabilities, but to all marginalized populations. You know, we're doing a good deal of work right now in former Soviet republics, which have a large number of individuals who are Roma. Those individuals really are marginalized in the society and, you know, do not have the levels of self-determination that their peers do. In the United States, we don't do a good job with our recent immigrant populations. My daughter works as a high school teacher in El Paso, Texas. 98% of the children who she serves in her high school are Mexican American, and many of those children's parents have immigrated to the United States illegally. The children are United States citizens. Their parents could at any time, given the current changes that have occurred in our government, be told that they need to leave the country. That set of young children are growing up with a decidedly different set of opportunities for self-determination as many of their peers. So when we think about self-determination, we need to think about it broadly. I first want to start my presentation by asking you to think of at least one experience that you have had in your life where you were not in control of something, a decision, or some other thing that was really important to you, and others exerted control over those outcomes. Think about how you felt in that situation. When we ask most people that question, you know, people say things like, I felt disempowered. I felt that I wasn't valued. I felt that nobody was listening to me. Okay? And that is the experience of many people. I would say most people with intellectual and developmental disabilities. But now I'd like to flip things and ask you to think about a situation in your life where you had the degree of control you wanted over outcomes that were important to you. And in those situations, how did it feel to be in control? You know, people have many ways to describe it, but to summarize it, it feels good. It feels good to have control over decisions and choices that are important to us. And when that right is taken away, we don't feel good about ourselves. We don't feel good about our placement in society. So, what is self-determination? Well, we've kind of evolved our kind of operational definition of self-determination over the years. The earliest formal use of the term is in 1683, so it goes back a long way, where, you know, it referred to determinations of one's mind or will by itself toward an object. As it moved on, okay, we look at the work of John Locke, who was referred to earlier today, who referred to kind of, you know, self-determination, really looking at the basic rights of all individuals, you know, including their freedom, their equality, and their power to execute these wills. You know, Locke said that these rights are indistinguishable from people themselves and can't be given up to others, but only under conditions in which the individual gives their consent. And when those rights are taken away, when individuals don't consent to give up those rights, essentially, it's just another form of slavery. So, as we have studied self-determination over the years. We talk to a lot of people with disabilities, a lot of individuals who do work in this area, and these are just some of the kind of recent definitions of self-determination that have been provided to us as part of our work. Our colleague Mike Waymeyer from the University of Kansas views self-determination as volitional actions that allow one to kind of really act as a primary causal agent in one's life. A high school student in North Dakota, a state adjacent to where we come in Minnesota, said, self-determination is about believing in yourself. It's about making your own decisions and being willing to be responsible for them. And then finally, an old-time colleague of mine, Irving Martin, who was a gentleman who I met when he was about 60 years of age. Irving was the godfather of self-advocacy in the state of Minnesota. He was the one who started it. And by the time I met him, Irving had developed such self-advocacy and advocacy skills that he was standing up before our state legislature, before our national Congress, and advocating for the rights of disabilities. And when one day Irving and I were up for dinner and we were kind of waxing philosophical about self-determination, he said it's about power, it's about choice, and most important, it's about our right to chase our dreams, the chance to live our lives and direct our lives the way we want to, not the way other people expect us to. Now, I think that relates very nicely to Tim's idea that people with disabilities, the same way we have the right to make decisions which others don't agree with, which might not work out, also should have that right. So, before we talk a little bit more about our operational definition of self-determination, I'd like to talk a minute about what self-determination is not. Okay, it's not equivalent to the level of personal control you have over your life. That's a very simplistic notion of self-determination, and you'll see in a minute why I say that. It's not about things which are limited to making choices. It's not an either-or experience. You can be self-determined or you cannot. And it's not about parents, family members, or other substitute decision makers exercising control over the life of a person with a disability. I'll be the first one to say that in most cases, a family member having control and making decisions about outcomes associated with a person with disability in their family is probably better than the service system doing that. On the other hand, that isn't the same as self-determination. So, as we did research in this area, we spent a lot of time talking to people with disabilities, talking to providers, talking to family members, and, actually doing this at an international level. We came up with the following definition of self-determination, which has really driven our research, our kind of educational development and training development over the last 25 years or so. Self-determination refers to individuals exercising the degree of control over their lives that they desire within those areas of life that are important to them. Now, you might say, well, how is that different than some of those other definitions that Brian just provided to us? Well, I think there are a couple of things in this definition which do make it decidedly different. Number one, it's that self-determination doesn't have to do with the absolute control you have over your life. It has to do with exercising the degree of control over your life that you desire. It also has to do with exercising control over those things in life that are important to you. There are some things in life that are not that important to me to make decisions about. I honestly don't care about those things. There are other aspects of life where if you try to take away my decision-making authority, my power to really kind of control the outcomes I experience, you're going to see me put up a really, really intense fight to keep those rights. So, why is self-determination different than just personal control? Well, number one, most people don't desire to have complete control over every area of their life. I mean, think about, for those of you who are parents, okay, you have a partner. Do you want to make all the child-rearing decisions yourself, or do you prefer to share decision-making authority with somebody who you trust, somebody whose opinions you value? In some areas of life, a person may not particularly value having control and may voluntarily cede it to another. You know, the example I use all the time is financial control in my family. It rests decidedly with my wife. She has an MBA. She works for a large airline. She makes decisions that have to do with $350 million projects. And she does a lot better job at it than I do. So essentially, I voluntarily ceded control over that area of my life to somebody who I trust. Somebody whose decisions I know will be not just of her own best interest, but my best interest. You know, it's the same type of relationship that we have with physicians who treat us. You know, I don't want to go to a physician who diagnoses me and then says, so Brian, what do you want to do? You know, I mean, I want to work with my physician to make a decision. I want to, at this point, partially cede control. The other thing about self-determination that we see and that we know is that there are individual differences, and people's levels of self-determination, you know, change over time and based upon those areas of life that we value at certain times in our development. You know, think about the young child. You know, for the infant, literally, you know, the parents are making most of the decisions. But I would argue that self-determination begins very early in life, when infants cry. Well, what do you mean? Why is that self-determination? Well, what we know from early child development research that's been done is that infant cries vary in frequency and intensity, and whether they build gradually or whether they are at full bore right away. And what happens is that mothers and caregivers, within a relatively short period of time, learn to kind of read the individual characteristics of their children's cries. And they then respond to the child based upon the reading of that communication. It's a simple, rudimentary form of communication that develops over time. And as children develop better ways to communicate their needs and their wants and their desires, they exercise control over more areas of their life and greater amounts of control. And just as important, they don't need that caregiver as much to be around to help them exercise control. Now, when we think about self-determination as it relates to adults and young adults with intellectual and developmental disabilities, we need to understand that it involves not just control over long-term decisions, where and with whom to live, how to spend one's kind of support funding, what type of work to do, but it also has to do with control over day-to-day decisions. What to wear, what to eat, what to watch on television, what time to go to bed. All too often in the US, what we see, given our current system, is that there's a real focus on control over these long-term decisions. We want to make sure, through personal futures planning or person-centered planning, that people get to choose where they live. But oftentimes what happens is that once they've chosen where to live, especially if it's in a setting where they are getting supports, 24-hour supports, all of a sudden they find they have very little control over their life. I mean, going to the refrigerator to get a snack when you're hungry isn't allowed because, well, the health person has come in and told us that you are 15 pounds overweight, so you're on a restricted calorie diet. You know, or wanting to stay up late because there's a television program on. No, you've got to go to bed at 10 p.m. because that's when most of the staff go home, and we only have one staff member here, and you all have to be in bed. So when we think about self-determination, think about it as including not just those long-term decisions, kind of self-directed supports, but also those day-to-day types of situations that all of us find ourselves in. So, as I said earlier, there's a lot of misunderstanding about the self-determination construct. You know, I think all too often we look at it as an either-or thing. You know, people think that self-determination implies fully independent performance of behaviors, or the person can't be self-determined. Or people think that self-determination is just about choice-making. And it's not. It's much broader than that. It's much more all-encompassing than that. We also know that at least some of our colleagues who have done a lot of work in this area believe that there are a specific set of skills, knowledge, and attitudes and beliefs that are necessary for self-determination. We disagree with that. Okay? And I think we come from a perspective which is very kind of supportive of what Tim was talking about this morning, and that there are skills, there is knowledge, and there are attitudes and beliefs that support self-determination, But we can't just keep focusing on the person. We need to start focusing on what we can do to change the environment to make it more supportive of self-determination to more people. And then finally, there's oftentimes a misunderstanding that self-determination is a program you can implement. You know, I've got a self-directed supports program. That's what we call it in the US. Okay? So everybody in that program is more self-determined than people who are not. Self-determination is an ongoing process, but it's an individual process. It's not about student-led IEPs. It's not about person-centered support planning. It's not about independent budgets, because we've seen all of those different types of programs not support self-determination. So what is self-determination? Well, the way we view it is that it's about supporting people to make the things in life that they want to happen actually happen in their lives. It's about supporting people to achieve desired life outcomes, especially people who are marginalized by society. A good friend of ours, John Smith, said that this area of self-determination would really look quite different if we could make one change in how we view our world. And he argues that typically we view our world as persons with disabilities and persons without disabilities. And John, who has a disability himself, actually multiple disabilities, once told me that, you know, we would be much better off, and this whole notion of self-determination would make so much more sense to us if we looked at the world as people with disabilities and people who are temporarily able-bodied. Because if we look at statistics, you go into our insurance industry, okay, one of the things that you'll understand is that at some point in our lives, most of us, I think it's like 87%, will experience disability of some type, some nature, some level of severity. And if we started thinking of this not as an us versus them type, but as a society in which we currently don't have disabilities, but in all likelihood will experience them at some point in our lives, we might be much more supportive of really trying to change our society, change our service system to better support the self-determination of individuals with disabilities. So I'd like to play just a quick video. These are all only a minute. Hopefully I'll have audio on this one. About what one self-advocate thinks about self-determination and the service system and supports.
Number one, I think the biggest thing in self-determination is listening to what people want and being able to help people do what they want with their life and to help them, you know, dream about what it is they want in their life and then be able to put it into action. For me, that's a lot of what self-determination is, being able to know what you want and then being able to go for it and having somebody else that believes in it, that's able to help you go for what you want in your life. To me, that's what self-determination is. And not being able to not stopping until you get what you need and want for your life, what makes you happy.
Now, there's been a lot of research in the United States done over the last 20 years that focuses on self-determination. As a whole, however, okay, you know, what we have found is that almost all of this research shows a much greater focus on supporting the self-determination of persons with mild to moderate intellectual and developmental disabilities, rather than those who have the most significant intellectual disabilities. You know, there are studies that have focused on the development of choice-making, decision-making skills. There are studies that have focused on kind of helping individuals with disabilities or supporting them to gain a higher sense of self-confidence, to help them better understand the service system. But persons with the most significant intellectual and developmental disabilities tend to be ignored. And most of the skills that they're taught in at least the US educational system are not skills that necessarily lead to their being able to exercise a degree of control over their lives that they desire, over those aspects of life that are important to them. They really have tended to be the forgotten ones, even though if we look at all the research, they are the persons with disabilities who have the lowest levels of self-determination, who struggle the most to exercise self-determination in their lives. So why have we ignored these individuals? Well, there are a number of issues related to that. Viewing self-determination as kind of an either-or issue. In our service system, oftentimes, what people are told is, well, once you demonstrate to me that you have the skills that allow one to be self-determined, then we'll give you more opportunities for self-determination. There's a belief that a lot of people with intellectual disabilities, especially those who have more significant support needs, wouldn't even benefit from self-determination. So this idea that people with the most significant intellectual disabilities can't acquire the capacities or wouldn't be interested in self-determination has really permeated a lot of work that's been done in the area, and has been one of the things that we have been fighting against personally, for the last 20 years. So as a result of the work that we've done, primarily kind of qualitative work, sitting down and talking to people with disabilities, and trying to figure out, how they conceptualize self-determination, taking a look at the literature and what we know about our service system, we've developed what we call a tripartite, three-part model of self-determination. Okay? And I'd like to introduce you to it because I think it really helps you better understand the impact that not just the individual, but the society and the service system within which the individual functions has on self-determination. So the first thing, we look at self-determination, at least partially, being based upon the exercise of control. What is the level of control the person exercises on their life over both those long-term decisions as well as those short-term decisions? How important are those areas of life where the person is exercising control to the individual? Are these aspects of life that are critical for them to have control over? Or are these aspects of life which we essentially fed to them like scraps of food, so that we can feel better about ourselves rather than truly providing them with the opportunity to be self-determined? And then finally, do they have the desired degree of control? In those areas where they want full control, do they have it? In those areas that they really don't want control, are they allowed to share it with others and select who is going to be that other? And then finally, in those areas where they want to share control, do they have that option? We view self-determination really as being the intersection of those three places. When you exercise the level of control that you desire over those things in life that are important to you. And again, all of these tend to change over time. So really, that figure is constantly moving around. You want more control, you want less control. You want to share control in this area, you want full control in another area. Now, we believe that self-determination is supported by a lot of things. Skills, knowledge, and a set of attitudes and beliefs. But what we often forget about is that it's also supported by the environment. Residential and employment staff, school staff, family and community. And it's this piece of self-determination where we focused our work. So, our colleague Mike Waymeyer has done a lot of work in the area of self-determination, and we've also done work in this area, and we find that there are a wide variety of skills, knowledge bases, and attitudes and beliefs that support self-determination. They're not necessary for it, but they support it. The more of these you have, the research suggests, the less support you need from others. However, I would argue that as long as an individual can communicate yes or no, non-verbally, maybe it's just raising an eyebrow, maybe it's just blinking once or twice. If we ask them the right questions, if we're patient enough, if we learn to understand the way they communicate, they can have a relatively high degree of self-determination in their life. However, all too often, what we find is that we don't train social workers, case managers, direct service staff, school teachers to be sensitive to the way people with disabilities communicate their needs in life, especially when they might not have relatively well-developed oral communication skills. And as a result, we fall back on the excuse saying that, well, the reason this person doesn't have much self-determination in their life is because they don't have the requisite skills, attitudes and beliefs, or knowledge to support self-determination. what we've done is really try to focus our work on the missing factor, and that is the environment. You know, we know from our own research and research of others that without opportunities for self-determination, people lose the motivation to exercise control over their lives. We know that many of those capacities that are supportive of self-determination can only be acquired through real-life experiences. So, for example, we work with family members from a very early age to provide their children with disabilities with opportunities for choice and control in their lives. Because those simple decisions a child is making at 2 and 3 years of age, those simple choices will develop over time. All too often what we see in our service system is the first time a person with an intellectual developmental disability gets to make a decision in their life is when they are involved in their own transition planning. You know, they're 14, 15, 16 years of age, and the school comes together, the individualized educational planning team, and asks them, so what do you want to do with your life after school? Well, if you've never been given a decision-making opportunity, if you've never been given the opportunity to exercise control of your life until then, that's a very daunting decision to make. And what our colleagues have often done in the educational system is view the young adult's inability to clearly articulate how they want to spend the rest of their life by saying, see, we told you the person doesn't have the capacity. Again, you know, an entirely an argument based upon fallacy. So what we've tried to do is develop self-determination kind of within the context of an ecological model. You know, a model of environmental organization that looks at what supports can we provide people with disabilities at the microsystem level, the immediate behavioral environment in which they lead their lives, at the mesosystem level, the connections between those areas in which they lead their lives, kind of the connections between the family and the school, the residential program and the employment program. At the exosystem level, kind of how the environmental context has an impact on family, how the environmental system has an impact on those relationships or linkages between systems. And then finally, at the macro system level, that global level which kind of really has to do with kind of societal ideology, you know, thinking about persons with disabilities. So the model we've developed, again, is complex, but I think self-determination, at least the way it's exercised, is a complex phenomenon to look at. So again, we're not discounting the person and the competencies that they have, but we're also trying to take a look at what we can do from an intervention standpoint with families, with the peer group, with the school and work microsystem, with the residential services system, the employment services system, to better support self-determination without telling people with disabilities what we tell them all the time, is that, well, you need to change. Our perspective is we need to change the system to support self-determination, rather than telling people with disabilities that they need to change in order to have the opportunity to be more self-determined. So again, we see it as an ecological process, a process which changes over time, a process which is complex, but something that we can effectively intervene with in order to support a lot of the things that Tim was talking about this morning. You know, are incredible supports for people with disabilities who are adults to exercise the control over their lives that they want in those areas of life that are important to them. Okay? It's those types of changes in our service system that we've been trying to focus on, but a little bit more at a microanalytic level. So let me tell you a little bit of what we have learned after 25 years of work in the area of self-determination. Okay, and these may seem relatively simplistic, but what we have found is that oftentimes we overlook the obvious. Number one, we have found that all persons, okay, and I should say all persons who are living, all persons who are have conscious thought, are capable of some degree of self-determination. The difference is that some people need few supports, other people need more supports. I have yet to interact with somebody with a disability, even those persons with the most significant, intensive support needs, who have multiple disabilities, who aren't capable of some level of self-determination. Secondly, self-determination exists along a continuum. And that continuum is limited much more frequently by the system and the society the individual lives in than by the individual themselves. Number three, self-determination is a lifespan issue. You know, we need to be looking at it from infancy until death. Number four, self-determination is naturally reinforcing. When individuals experience self-determination, expect them to ask for more. So don't start supporting self-determination unless you're ready to follow it through. And allow people to make mistakes. Allow people to make decisions that we as support staff, that family members might be a little concerned about. Self-determination requires the assumption of some level of risk. Okay, whenever we exercise control, we take some risk. The decisions we make, the choices we make, may not work out the way we want them to. The key is to minimize risk, not to attempt to eliminate it, to make risk reasonable. When we talk about self-determination with staff who support persons with disabilities, you know, we typically get questions like, well, does that mean that if the person needs 24-hour supervision, we just let them walk out the door and do whatever they want? No, that's not what we mean. You know, what we do mean is that if the person wants to walk out the door, okay, you minimize the risk that they may encounter. You provide them with the supports they need. You know, I really responded to the story Tim told earlier this morning about the young person who kind of disappeared and they found him in McDonald's, and you know, that individual had literally exercised self-determination and it helped integrate himself into the community. I have a similar story. You know, I was working with a number of undergraduate students who were providing social supports to people with disabilities a number of years ago, and the idea was to help them get out into the community and do things. And I had one young man, he was an undergrad, who was a senior, he was a psychology major. He was working with two people because he really was enjoying the work he was doing. And he went to this group home. There were, I think, 4 people living there. And he went to pick up one of the persons he was working with. And he left, and you know, they went out, had a good time, doing some things in the community. Basically, he was including this person into a weight training program at a local gym. Well, unbeknownst to him, when he left the community residence with the gentleman he was working with, a young woman who he was also working with left the residence too. And she disappeared for a period of time. And staff called the police. They were, you know, all upset about, you know, what had happened. You know, the one thing they didn't think about is, similar to the story you told him, is where would this woman go? Well, our undergrad student was working with this woman who was about 60 years of age to help her kind of be included within a kind of a senior group that met at the local park. Well, when they eventually got to the local park, okay, they found this woman playing cards with her peers. They found that her peers had arranged for her to have lunch with them, and basically had invited her to come back and be a regular member of their card club, which met 2 days a week to play cards at this local park and community center. Well, to tell you why we need to look at changing the environment to better support self-determination, I need to tell you what the staff of this woman did. Okay? They basically said that she absconded from the community residence without permission, that she placed herself at risk, and their intervention, rather than saying that, my God, look at all these skills she has. She found her way to the park, she integrated herself into this group, she had a great time. Their intervention was to put locks on the doors so that people couldn't, quote, abscond from the community residence without their knowing. Again, a good reason why we need to start looking at, number one, assuming that there is some risk to self-determination, and number two, that we need to work with staff to support it more than trying to require people with disabilities to demonstrate higher skill levels. 2 other things that we have learned that I think are really important. Number one, self-determination results from an interaction between the individual and their environment. it always occurs within a social context. And, as we found relatively recently, or discovered ourselves, okay, self-determination is always exercised within the context of relationships. Think about it. You know, if we were alone, if we lived in vacuums, everybody would have complete self-determination. But we don't. You know, so we exercise self-determination in the context of informal relationships with our family and our friends. We exercise self-determination within the context of small systems, such as one's employer. And we exercise self-determination within the context of large systems, such as the state. But self-determination, we think, really needs to be looked at as being exercised within the context of relationships. And I think that makes what we have learned so much more important and so much more valuable. Now, we know from our own research and that of others that the manner in which people view and express self-determination is affected by their family, by their age, by their sex or gender, and by their culture. You know, what's appropriate in one culture is not necessarily appropriate in another. We know that families have their own perspectives on self-determination. Typically what we have found is that when the family values self-determination, everyone in the family exercises high levels of self-determination, whether it's a child with a disability or a child without a disability. When families are operating within the context of kind of a more authoritarian parenting style, it's not just the child with a disability who exercises lower levels of self-determination, but everyone in the family. So what are the mediating factors that are related to self-determination? Well, we've looked at a number of things, you know, including social effectiveness, one's ability to use one's social skills, behaviors, and strategies to achieve perceived outcomes. And something that Tim talked about this morning, you know, that we refer to as social capital. You know, that network of social ties and supports and relationships that, you know, really supports somebody to achieve desired outcomes over time. And that social capital is developed over time. One of the things we know is that children who grow up, go to school in inclusive settings, develop more social capital with their peers than children who are in segregated settings. Why? Because they have that opportunity to develop relationships with a wide variety of individuals, as opposed to, in the US, 6 or 8 students who they see on an ongoing basis in a special education class. We know that kind of affiliating with others who share common interests, common characteristics, you know, affiliating with others who have different characteristics, bonding and bridging, you know, are all really important parts of developing the social capital that you need to exercise self-determination in your life. We know that especially for the persons who we spend most of our time working with, individuals who have kind of complex support needs, individuals who have intensive support needs, kind of the social capital that they develop, having a supportive social network, has more to do with how well they're going to live their lives after they leave school, in the adult world, so to speak, than how well they read or write, whether they can do math kind of, you know, in their head, or they need a calculator to do it, or just about any other academic skill. And again, there's that piece on social inclusion. You know, so important, that societal acceptance of persons with disabilities, not just in the school context, you know, but in the community context. You know, as Tim said, being of the community as opposed to being in the community. One of the things that we've seen in our international work is that, you know, while we're working with a number of countries that have signed the CRPD, Article 24, who are committed, at least on paper, to the full inclusion of students with disabilities, is that at this point, what we see is physical integration. We see a child with a disability kind of placed within a regular education classroom. But we don't see that child being of the classroom. Socially, they're not included. Instructionally, often, they're not included. They just sit in the back room. In the United States, the only difference is they sit in the back room with an educational assistant. And with many of the countries we're working who don't have the resources to hire educational assistants, you know, they're just sitting in the back of the classroom, not doing anything. You know, that type of inclusion is not going to support self-determination. The other thing that we think is important to understand is that self-determination shouldn't necessarily be valued in and of itself, or for what it helps us to achieve, but we need to look at both of those. Because what we know from the research that's been done so far is that children with disabilities, who as they develop into youthhood, as they move into adulthood, who have higher levels of self-determination, experience a higher quality of life. They tend to be more employed. They tend to have better jobs in the community. They show enhanced levels of achievement in school. We know that enhanced self-determination encourages pro-social behavior, and it increases responsibility. So it's both a mediating factor and a moderating factor. So what do we know, at least in the US, about how well education supports self-determination? Well, what this graph shows is the opportunities that children in the United States have for self-determination in the educational context from age 5 to age 20 plus. Now that graph isn't upside down, it's not on its side, but it should worry all of us. Because what we and our colleagues have found is that, at least in the US educational system, children have the most opportunity for self-determination in the classroom when they're in kindergarten and first grade. And as they get older, even though they're developing more skills, even though they're developing the capacities to exercise more control over their lives, in school we provide them with fewer and fewer opportunities. Yes?
מי שיכול לתרגם? גם עם הסיפור שככל שהם גדלים יותר, הפערים גדולים יותר. זאת אומרת, הפער באותה כיתה, ואז זה יוצר סיטואציה של שילוב מאוד, שיכולה להיות לא מכבדת כל כך. כי הם לא... וגם שככל שההתמקדות היא בלימודים קוגניטיביים, זה עוד יותר משאיר אותם בחוץ. וככל שהולכים לבגרויות, אז בכלל זה יוצר מין... כשהפערים מאוד גדולים זה דבר שיכול ליצור את החוויה של שילוב מאחורה, כזה שאתה יושב בצד ולא מתייחסים אליך.
So he's saying that within school inclusion what happens is, as you, and this might explain the upside down graph, that as you get older the gap between you and students without disabilities gets wider. The cognitive ability develops at a different pace, which would keep the gap between your abilities and the other children in the classroom increasing and increasing more as you get older, which might explain the fewer opportunities that are there.
Well, I would say you're 100% correct with that assumption. However, this graph has nothing to do with children with disabilities. These are the opportunities that we provide children without disabilities to exercise self-determination within the context of education. I mean, we do a very poor job. I mean, think about it. You know, when I was in high school taking chemistry and physics classes, I had very few opportunities to exercise self-determination within the context of the school day. When I was in kindergarten, you know, I had many more opportunities. You know, so we don't do a good job in the U.S. at supporting the development of those capacities that support self-determination for not just our students with disabilities, but also our students without disabilities. And I would argue that one of the reasons, for example, in the U.S., we have so many problems with young adults with disabilities, especially those who live or are growing up in impoverished situations, you know, joining gangs, you know, dealing drugs, is because we don't look at self-determination as being important except for children and young adults and adults with disabilities, when it's much more broad than that. This is just a graph, which I'll try to explain quickly, which suggests to me, it was based on some research we did a couple of years ago, that looked at the extent to which children with disabilities and young adults with disabilities had more or less control, okay, over their life than they desired. And what basically the graph shows is that kind of across this age range of children and young adults, again, school-age children, and I believe this group was from 3rd grade through high school, okay, there were many more areas of life where children with disabilities had less control than they really wanted, and they had more control than they wanted. Okay, essentially something that we already knew, but we really felt needed to be, from a research standpoint, supported before we could go further with our work. So, less control than preferred. Okay, major decisions, you know, about where to live, housemates, roommates, and pets. Decisions involving money, you know, adults with disabilities, at least in our country, intellectual and developmental disabilities, have very little control over how their money is spent. Not just support money, but also the money that they have, which is their personal spending money. What to do in their free time, what to do and when to go out in the community. You know, be able to spend time alone with a boyfriend or a girlfriend, where they work, what they do at their work site. So, getting back to this idea of what is self-determination, you know, it's all of these issues. It's an educational issue. It's about teaching skills and what goes on in the classroom. It's a psychological issue. It's about motivating people to take greater control over their lives and realizing that if we don't provide the opportunity for self-determination, we are essentially extinguishing motivation to be self-determined. It's a human service issue. It's definitely about providing more inclusive, more self-determined supports and services, but it's also a civil rights issue. It's about guaranteeing the basic civil rights of people with disabilities within our societies. Can we have the lights for a minute? I'm going to just play another brief video on the notion of self-determination and civil rights.
I got involved with disability because I found out it wasn't my fault. It was society's fault that was disabling me. I wasn't the disabled thing yet. It was society that's disabling me. And that meant that meant talking about social change. And once you understand that that's what it's all about, then you become part of the civil rights movement. It was only when disability was articulated in that way. And if we are part of the civil rights movement, then as all other civil rights movements, they had to use tactics of non-violent civil disobedience to draw attention to the issues that confronted them and that needed to be changed in society.
Now, what that gentleman was saying with respect to self-determination remains true to today. Yesterday, we were watching the news, or I was looking at the news on CNN, and what I saw were people with disabilities of many different types being carried by police officers out of the halls of our Congress, where they are currently protesting about severe cuts in Medicaid services, which are the types of services that are supported and help people with disabilities live in community settings rather than in institutional settings. So CNN did a big piece on several individuals, one with an intellectual disability, one who had spina bifida, a third who had cerebral palsy, engaged in nonviolent protest, you know, in the halls of Congress. You know, so self-determination is not just kind of a personal issue, it is very much a civil rights issue. Now, I have to go backwards here. How do I do that? Here we go. We have been conducting a lot of research over the years to see if we can come up with ways that better support self-determination. You know, previous research basically focused on teaching people with disabilities new skills, new capacities, requiring them or asking them to change the way they behave if they wanted to be more self-determined. You know, we think there were a lot of dangers to this individual approach. You know, some people might not be able to acquire, you know, the capacities being taught. And, you know, all too often in the U.S., you know, the rights of people with disabilities are restricted until we tell them they can demonstrate to us that they've acquired certain skills. And a lot of people with disabilities that we work with have told us that's their big fear about all of the research, all of the work that has been done in the area of self-determination. That it is just another thing you're going to tell us, you have to have these skills and these capacities and these kind of attitudes and belief systems before we will allow you to exercise self-determination in your life. We think that an alternative approach is needed. You know, an approach which kind of really focuses on the ecological characteristics related to self-determination, including the organizational climate, you know, agency policies and regulations. You know, not just the knowledge, skills, and attitudes and beliefs that that support self-determination on the part of people with disabilities, but making sure that direct support professionals, we refer to them as DSPs, have the necessary skills and knowledge and attitudes and beliefs to support self-determination. And then to take a look at, on an individual basis, the extent to which their behaviors, the professionals who are paid to support people with disabilities, actually engage in behavior that supports self-determination. So essentially we have an ecological puzzle. And you know, we believe that in order to fully support self-determination, you know, we really have to have all of these pieces of the puzzle present. You know, and that includes not just access to formal supports, but access to informal supports. You know, I worked with a lot of provider agencies, which people with disabilities tell me that they develop a friend outside in the community or at work, and the friend comes to pick them up to do something in the community, and the provider agency tells the friend, well, I'm sorry, you need to have volunteer training before you and this person go out into the community. You know, and the individual typically says, but I'm just their friend. Well, I'm sorry, but we can't allow you to take them out into the community until you have volunteer training. You know, it has to do with making sure that there's consumer involvement in all decision making, that there's an encouragement and a reinforcement of self-determined behavior and attempts to exercise self-determination, that we truly do plan for individuals, and not just plan, but support person-centered service delivery. I mean, all too often in the US, we see person-centered plans being developed, but we don't see person-centered services being delivered. So there are a lot of pieces to this ecological puzzle that we need to work on. So are there costs to supporting self-determination? Yes, there are. You know, there's additional time and effort that staff need to spend, that families need to spend to understand how to effectively support it. There are changes in the way our service system works, and the way we think about providing supports with disabilities that are going to need to take place. It's going to take creativity. It's going to take thinking outside of the box, and a willingness to allow people with disabilities who we support to take risks, sometimes to fail, and sometimes to experience the consequences of not necessarily making good decisions and choices, and experiencing outcomes other than that they wish to experience. And finally, it's going to take increased flexibility on the part of staff to support self-determination. What are the benefits, though? I think I've already gone over a lot of those. You know, that it enhances quality of life, it promotes self-awareness, it increases responsibility, and it enhances not only independence, but interdependence. You know, those aspects of life that we all consider to be extremely important for leading a high quality of life. Now, what we've also found is that when people with disabilities, intellectual and developmental disabilities, experience self-determination over time, okay, it promotes, you know, a lot of other things in their lives. It encourages them to be involved in self-advocacy. Okay? Our self-advocacy movement in the United States is responsible for most of the positive changes that have occurred for people with disabilities. That and the advocacy movement started by families. It hasn't been coming from kind of a federal level or a state level. It's really families and people with disabilities taking schools, taking the service system to court, and court decisions which have forced kind of the service system and our federal system to change to be more supportive of self-determination. Now, I'm going to turn things over to Rnata now. He's going to talk about a little bit about the work that we are doing to support self-determination kind of in community settings, and a little bit about how we are kind of developing ways to assess self-determination, because we want to know whether the system is doing a good job at supporting it. Rnata.
So, we do want to make sure that there's time for questions, so I'll try to be as efficient as I can. So in the recent years, I've worked with Bryan and some of our colleagues in group homes. So some of you kind of nodded their heads when group homes were mentioned. And the charge that we had was to work with direct support professionals who work with people with disabilities to build their capacity so that they have the necessary skills to support people with disabilities. We also, because people need to know if our training and our work in these settings was effective, so we have to think about ways that we can assess people with disabilities and also if we're making any difference with the actual staff. So as you know, in your experience, the typical ways of assessing are surveys, interviews, they require verbal skills, but a lot of the people we work with, and you work with, I'm sure, are nonverbal or have very, very limited skills, communication skills. So Brian and his colleagues, and then I came up later, developed some of the scales that are sort of the ones where you have to administer interview protocol. So there are scales on exercise of control, decision-making preference, and importance scale. So this is a one-on-one interview with the person with a disability, but also with the staff member to get some sense of what people are thinking. And here you can kind of see the areas, what is being addressed when the assessments are conducted. I'm just going to skip a little bit. So the problem is, as I said, that a lot of these scales are not really relevant to the people who A, cannot fully comprehend the question, and B, that they cannot respond using their words. So something I'm very excited about that I developed with Brian on his projects is the development of an observation system that is specific to the skills of self-determination. And it's specifically developed for people with intellectual and developmental disabilities, because as you know from your own work, it's really unfair that we exclude a lot of people from telling us how the system is working for them if they cannot respond to us verbally. And so we have developed this coding system with a software, and we code various aspects of self-determination based on the self-determination theory that Brian here has presented. And we have done a lot of work in group homes. In this particular project, you can see we were there for 72 hours of observations at 10-minute chunks. So for 10 minutes, we would come and observe a certain individual in a group home to see how they were interacting with their staff, whether they were interacting with their peers or with the people who lived in the group home with them, and what kind of interactions were taking place when we were there and sort of represented what was going on. And this is just to show a screen from, it's done on touchscreen tablet, so it's very efficient, and it's very, very, well, it's not very disruptive. And so you can see some of the staff behaviors. So the yellow codes refer to duration code, something that takes, we count in seconds. So how many seconds or minutes does the staff member model self-determination behavior? Do they teach self-determination behavior to the person? What kind of questions they are asking to people? So are they only asking yes and no questions? Or if somebody has a milder disability, it's much more appropriate to ask open-ended questions or provide other opportunities for responding. We look at types of reinforcement, if there is any self-regulation going on, problem solving and advocating. And whether there is this particular code is very interesting because it looks at the percentage of time that the people with disabilities interact with other people with disabilities in the group home setting. And as you will see on another slide, that is unfortunately very, very limited.
Rnata, this was a plain observations. You did not intervene or gave any counseling. This is just as it was.
That's absolutely correct. So we did the observations before we implemented our training for staff to kind of see the levels of self-determination, and without any intervention from us. Then there was a series of trainings that we did for the staff, and then we also assessed after the fact. But it's a really good question because I'm sure in a practical life you could use it as an intervention tool to look at what behaviors are happening or not, and then work more sort of continuously. So that's a really good question. Okay, yeah, this is a little too detailed. And so basically some of the numbers, and we'll be happy to share some of the more detailed slides with you, but we found that there is unfortunately very little interaction in the US group homes, at least in Minnesota, between staff and the people with disabilities. So what does that mean? It means that very little opportunities are provided for self-determination. As Tim and Brian both talked about, self-determination doesn't happen in vacuum. So if I don't interact with anyone, and this goes to staff and also with other people with disabilities in the home, then how self-determined can I really be? So we saw that as a real big problem. Although the staff, we saw they were always there, so there's some sort of a ratio that's mandated by law for a group home. It was only 17 to 25% of the time there was any social interaction going on. So you can just think about your own life and how much in a workplace or in your home, compared to that, how little the interaction takes place. Then the other one that's really interesting, I think, the one-on-one interaction between staff and consumers was only 13% of the time. So the other interaction was in a group. So this is how little time there was a one-on-one interaction. And this one is the one I was referring to that's even worse, that the people who lived together in that home for whatever reason, they just did not interact. They were in their homes, in their rooms, or they would be just doing totally different things, not talking to each other, not, doing leisure activities together, for example.
Question, please.
Yes?
The cognitive level of the people.
The cognitive level of the people with disabilities that we were looking at? Yes. Yes. So we were working with people, there was a range. I would say moderate to severe disabilities, more moderate than severe, but we certainly had at least 25% of the sample that had severe intellectual and developmental disabilities. So we had a lot of people who, I would say there were also 25 to 30% with whom we could ask questions, we could have an interview, use those scales that I talked about at the beginning. The rest of the people, we only could do observations, which really was the point, was to show that there is a large number of people who we cannot ask how we are doing, how the staff is doing. We could at least have an observation and see, with respect to self-determination, what was going on. Does that help?
Thank you.
Yeah. So, we also part of, and again, I won't rattle off all these numbers, but the point being is that we were looking for a relationship between the scales we administered as an interview and the observational tool. Why? To see if it's valid and if it measures the self-concept of self-determination. So that was part of our project as well. And we found that the relationship was pretty strong. You can see the correlation. So that was really nice to see. So what are our next steps? I want to get to actually, for the sake of time, I want to talk about the lessons. So we had a pre-test and a post-test with the interviews and the observations. But what we were really looking at is the effectiveness of training for direct support professionals in the group homes. We have developed 14 lessons to help staff be more effective in supporting people with disabilities. And the lessons, the training also included coaching and mentoring, which we thought was really critical. And it wasn't just coaching that was based on, how we felt things were going, but we used the data from our observation tool to specifically point out to the staff. So we would say, last time we came, there was very little going on between you and the people with disabilities, and we would say it's about 15-20% below what is average, and then we will talk about what might have been going on in the home, why it was, what might be done differently. We will tell them you asked 18 questions that are yes and no questions, and you have people with mild disabilities in your home, why didn't you go to some questions that were a little bit more complex? You know, that people are capable of giving you an answer. So anyway, we had a very detailed sort of coaching sessions that were very interesting. So the modules, some of the modules you will see as I show you the topics were for individuals with emerging and limited communication skills and with high support needs, and some were for people who were more with the moderate to mild disability range. So that's the B. And this is just to show you some, these are not all of the modules we developed, but some of the things we focused on. So you can see a lot is on decision making and choice making for people with limited and more developed communication skills. We spent quite a bit of time talking about group decision making and building consensus, which was specifically very useful for the group home where there are multiple people with disabilities living together. We developed, there was one of our newer modules was on challenging behavior, but not just about that, it was in relation to self-determination. What Bryan and Tim talked about is the importance of balancing risks and opportunities. So that was one of our more recent ones. And also how to develop advocacy skills, not just for yourselves, but at the systems level. Because a lot of the people were self-advocates for a very, very long time. And so we felt for staff it was really important to know the advocacy at the systems level. This is just an example of a lesson from the lesson on challenging behavior. So we have some samples here to show you what we might be covering. We focus quite a bit about the different functions of behavior. So in relation to advocacy of self-determination, from giving up to advocacy, self-advocacy. And we have a lot of activities, so this is not just lectures we do with staff, we have a lot of activities and demonstrations and videos. Here is another handout and activity that we go over, different types of levels of advocacy depending on the level of support that the person needs. And the last couple slides are just that in the last couple of years, we have taken the work from the group home setting to supporting self-determination of family members of people with disabilities. Because in the US, I don't know how it is in Israel, but I would say over half of people with disabilities live with their family members. And so it was really important for us to tailor these lessons or concepts that were for direct support professionals for family members. So again, it was based on the 25 years of research that Bryan was describing. And we used our first part, so we just don't create these from a theory. We do sit down and we run sort of quantitative-based focus groups with the parents to tell us what's important for them. So it's not just telling them, the theory says this and this is how we're going to develop it. So it's very person-centered and it's taking into account what are the current needs of families at this time who have people with disabilities. And we have learned from our colleagues and some of our work that it's really not useful to do these lessons in person because families have very limited time. Especially those families who have a child with a disability. So we are using the telehealth model to be able to do it as a webinar, as a live webinar. So if somebody is living A, in a rural area, or B, they don't have much time to come and sit down with us in a room, we can do this as an interactive training, but it's remote. So we are sort of testing, starting to test that model. And this is an example of the modules that we have developed. Some of it overlaps with the ones you have seen a minute ago, but we are also looking at, for example, understanding planning for life transitions, which was something that families told us was critical, and then setting and working toward person goals. So those are just some examples for you. And with that, we have about a little over 15 minutes for questions. So we wanted to make sure that we have a chance to ask for.
Could we have that last screenshot back?
Yes, absolutely. Yeah. So anything you want to know about self-determination or?
אני אנסה בעברית אם יש אפשרות לתרגם. בסופו של דבר, גם אם הגישה מוטמעת בשטח, יש את הנושא של הפיקוח, ומשרדי הממשלה שמתפתחים, אם זה משרד הבריאות, אם זה משרד הרווחה, איך בסוף זה פוגש את הפיקוח לגישה הזאת, והאם זה משהו שלפחות לדעת מה קורה שם בארצות הברית סביב הנושא הזה, האם זה משהו שמוטמע מעבר לרמת השטח, אלא גם לרמת הפיקוח.
So the question is, at the end of the day, the model is understandable, and I might be adding a bit of my own words here, and it makes a lot of sense. But the question that is asked is, what happens? How does it meet with the with the supervisor or policy makers who might have their own agenda? And when the supervisor says that this should be done this way, I would assume also in group home, the supervisor says this should happen like this and this and this. How does practice in reality meet the supervisors or the inspections?
Okay, that's an excellent question. We start out with the assumption that unless we can sell the supervisor, convince the supervisor that this is something which is not only going to be good for the persons with disabilities who they're supporting, but also for their staff, that we probably are not going to be successful. So in all of our training, supervisors are also included, and we spend a good deal of time, with them talking about how, for example, in the United States, we have a very difficult time keeping direct support professionals and teachers who teach children with the most intensive support needs actually working with those children. Teachers who teach children with very significant support needs, whether it's children with autism spectrum disorders, children with very intensive support needs because of cognitive disabilities, they quit their jobs after 5 to 6 years. Direct support staff, it is a massive problem in the United States. I don't know whether you've experienced this in Canada, but typically in our provider programs, the typical direct support professional works 6 to 9 months and then moves on. And part of that is because A, we don't pay them enough. But another very important part is that when they go into the job, essentially what they've been taught is that they're caregivers, as opposed to individuals who are supporting people with disabilities and advocating for them to experience the desired outcomes in life that they want. And one of the things we found is when they flip their role and they start seeing themselves as enablers in a good sense of the term, as support people who can actually help individuals experience the outcomes they want, they tend to be more effective, they tend to stay longer on the job because they're getting something out of the job.
Yeah, I would just add that. So I was oftentimes the person contacting the supervisors as the first point of contact in the agency when we were doing our work in group homes. And I found that because how the system is set up, the supervisors usually have more education. And so really they welcome the opportunity for their staff to learn something new, even more than the staff themselves. So they were like our champions, and oftentimes at the staff level, that's where things got a little bit rough. But usually at the supervisor level, they welcome some new training and new opportunity.
Everyone's struggling with English.
אני רוצה לשאול על הנושא של חברות שעלה בשתי ההצעות. גרם לי לחשוב מה בעצם החזון לגבי הנושא של חברויות של אנשים עם מוגבלות שכלית. כי זה די ברור שיש אתגר מאוד גדול, גם מהצד של האנשים עצמם שהם מאוד רוצים בזה, וגם מהצד של החברה שלא ברור עד כמה אני יכולה באמת להיות חברה שלהם.
It's really important. Before I ask Noah's question, I'll say that Noah works at AKIM, which is the National Association for the Rehabilitation of People with Intellectual Disabilities. So they're the main, it used to be, or I don't know if it still is called, a family organization when it was initiated in the 70s.
No, now it's the National Organization for People and Their Families.
And okay. So now brings up, I think, a very important question, and it came up with both lectures, the entire issue of friendship. And that being said, I gave you an introduction and forgot the question, but tell me. But tell me if I
I asked about the vision about the subject because it seems that people with intellectual disability, it's mostly important for them to have friends and to have bigger
social networks.
And on the other side, society, I think it's hard for her to accept them as friends. Whether it's the kids that works with them, whether it's kids in school, or it's works that they are working at the free market. So I wanted to know what do you think, what is your vision about this subject?
Sorry, but Akim has some very, very important projects out there. For example, it's been, I think, more than 10 years that together with the government they're operating a project for military inclusion of people with intellectual disabilities. People with intellectual disabilities go out and serve in the military. And it might sound strange otherwise, but in Israel, military is somewhere where everyone goes, and it's mostly an inclusive setting. And we followed this with research studies, and we do see that at the end of the day, many things happen, but not a real friendship where afterwards they will go home and be friends outside the military base.
One of the things that we found is that when you're talking about the social inclusion piece, the development of friendships, just because you provide opportunities for educational inclusion, you can't assume that just placing students with or without disabilities in a classroom is going to lead to the development of friendships. And that isn't because of anything inherent within children themselves. It's because of how good a job we as a society have done in teaching our children without disabilities that they are a lot more different than their peers with disabilities than they really are. What we have found is that you need to intentionally provide opportunities for students with and without disabilities to get together and to see how a disability is one among many characteristics that people have, and that oftentimes it's not the defining characteristic. One of the things that we've been, I think, very successful with is we developed a program called Together We're Better. Okay? It's an inclusive service learning program, both for elementary school students with or without disabilities, and for middle and high school students with or without disabilities. And what the students do is they come together, they identify community problems, which may or may not be related to disability, and they work together to develop plans and implement those plans to solve those community problems. One of the things that we have found is that the peers with disabilities who take part in this program always come back to us and say, oh my God, I didn't know these kids had the skills that they do. I didn't know that they had the capacity to be leaders. Let me give you an excellent example. I'll try to make it brief for not to throw something after you're hitting if I don't go too long. We recently implemented an international inclusive service learning project between students with or without disabilities in Minnesota and students with or without disabilities in San Pedro de Toas, Costa Rica. Okay? We had students with disabilities in our program in Minnesota who were working at kind of identifying current problems in Minnesota, and the same group in Costa Rica. And one of the things the students decided to focus on was climate change issues, because it's impacting both groups. Okay, well, we had a couple of students with disabilities in Minnesota who were Spanish-speaking. They were Mexican Americans. They had disabilities. Okay? In their school in the U.S., one was known as a troublemaker, and the other was known as a girl who was so quiet, no one ever heard her speak. Okay? We interacted with, again, these kids in Costa Rica. We brought our group down to Costa Rica. All of a sudden, those two Spanish-speaking children with disabilities became overnight the leaders, because we are a horribly multilingual nation, okay? I mean, even if our students take 7 or 8 years of Spanish or French or you name it, typically they don't learn to communicate effectively, but these two native Spanish speakers did. And all of a sudden, they were the leaders of the group. 2 students with disabilities leading, what was it, about 30 or 40 other students together, because they had the communication skills to interact with their peers in Costa Rica who didn't speak English that well. What we have found in most of our inclusive service learning programs is that type of change takes place, and there's a much greater appreciation of students for each other. The other things that we've worked with schools to do is when they implement inclusive service learning, to make sure that those projects get out in the media, so we can start changing the general public's perception of people with disabilities. In the US, the general perception of the public is that people with disabilities use resources. We say, no, people with disabilities are resources. We just have to provide them with opportunities to contribute to their communities. So that inclusive service learning piece is just one opportunity that we have taken to try to change public and student opinions. Yes?
One of the ways that I know some people in England that are working on the kind of things that you're working on and trying to improve self-determination, group homes and so on, and actually some of the people that do the training are actually people with mild intellectual disabilities, who they find that like the staff are more receptive when they hear it from somebody with a disability than when they hear from people without disability. I wondered if you'd done any work like trying to make these changes happen, but involving the people with the disabilities themselves as agents of change as well.
Oh,
Yes,
that's very much the case. You know, at our center, in all of the things that we do, we think it's critical to involve people with disabilities.
I think we didn't have time, but we wanted to talk about a little about an initiative at our institute called Self-Advocacy Online that is basically run by people with disabilities. And it's a website, but it's a whole initiative around the website where people with disabilities tell us as researchers and policymakers and our colleagues how to make things understandable for them so that they can take it and advocate. And so we can give you the link, but that's one initiative that's kind of a coherent.
In the UK, they have people with disabilities going into group homes to like do the observations that you're suggesting, and then giving feedback together with somebody else.
We do some of that. Yeah.
I mean, training, co-training with somebody with a disability is much more effective than training ourselves. We do a lot of group work with self-advocacy groups in the area. We have people first groups, which are very grassroots groups. And then we have a group we work with quite a bit called Advocating Change Together, which is it's a group of very sophisticated self-advocates. And we often either we train with them, or they're the ones who direct kind of our research. They're the ones who say, this is what you need to do research on, because this is what's important to us, and these are the barriers that we're facing. You know, there is within our self-advocacy movement, I don't know what you would call it, a saying now, nothing about us without us, and we truly at our center are trying to make sure that we respond to that. Other questions? I've got 2 here. We want to start with the one.
בעברית. Although I fear that although you're given permission to all of them, we might take the last one.
נעשה את זה מהר, אז אולי גם אני רוצה לדעת רק אם הם חקרו את העניין של עד כמה מהווה, היה גרף על הגדרה עצמית, ודווקא זה היה באוכלוסייה הרגילה. ועכשיו רציתי רק לדעת אם הם חקרו לבדוק עד כמה גדול החסם הזה בעצם, אם אדם לא יודע לעשות את הסיווג העצמי, את ההגדרה העצמית עבור עצמו, למה שהוא יקבל את הזכות? איפה התייחס לזכות של אדם עם מוגבלות לקום ולדרוש את שלו? זאת אומרת, זה יותר איזה סוג של אנטגוניזם. עכשיו, זה יכול לעבוד חסם בכלל בתוך חברה עבור אנשים עם מוגבלויות שבאים ודורשים עבור עצמם, ובעצם אם אוכלוסייה רגילה לא חוותה כל כך את החוויה של לדרוש עבור עצמי, אז למה שיאפשרו להם אדם עם מוגבלויות לדרוש עבור עצמי, אם הם חקרו את זה?
The question is, if you have researched, we saw the upside down graph where the self-determination goes down, and the question was if this happens in the general population, people are not even opportunities, and why would we expect people with disabilities on top of that to be able to stand up for themselves and voice their thoughts and opinion and be self-determined?
Well, that's exactly why, both some of our work and the work of some of our colleagues is focusing on trying to make more opportunities for self-determination available to students with disabilities within the school. Some colleagues of ours at the University of Kansas, Mike Waymeyer and Carrie Sjogren, have developed a program called the Self-Determined Learners Program, which is trying to do just that, expand opportunities for self-determination from, first grade way on up into high school.
In the inclusive setting, I think the inclusion is the key piece, rather than dealing with students without and with disabilities separately.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
There's one more question. We have one over here.
Yes, I think I've been working for many years with a group of adolescents with CP. And I found that self-determination, to work on self-determination in a group that is, that all people in the group were people with disabilities, was very helpful for going out afterwards and trying to influence different projects in the hospitals, for instance, self-determination in medical systems, that they needed the safe place where they could articulate their experiences before going out. And I wanted to ask about your experiences in that way.
Well, certainly the work we do isn't so much focused on helping people with disabilities develop, skills supportive of self-determination, but changing the environment to make it more supportive. However, our entire self-advocacy movement in the United States, which is extremely strong, is based on exactly that premise. One of the things we've started to do is move kind of opportunities for self-advocacy to high schools, so that we're not waiting until young adults become adults before we provide them with opportunities to acquire some of those skills and some of those capacities that support self-advocacy, but start early. The earlier we begin, the better. I know a lot of high schools, both in Minnesota and elsewhere in the United States, who now have self-advocacy programs. And one of the things they're teaching in those programs is self-determination skills.
In a more segregated type of
Yes.
environment.
Yeah, in an environment which is primarily students with disabilities.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Well, again, thank you.
Any question that comes afterwards, I promise to move it over. Homework. How many people here are signed up for tomorrow's session?
You should have asked that before you said
Yeah, so we, in preparation for tomorrow's session, which will be on a slightly different topic, it will be measuring outcomes in home and community-based services for people with disabilities. If you like, it's not compulsory, but we send
But it gets a grade.
Well, it might get a grade if you like. But we sent Shirley a link to, it's sort of a short survey where you think about the importance of measuring certain outcomes for people with disabilities. And it's very easy to do. You just click the link and you rate those outcome areas on a scale from 0 to 100. The only thing to remember is that you can only assign 100, and you have to assign 100 when you do so. And so this will help us to then share the data from you as well as our staff to compare what you think about measuring outcomes for people with disabilities in relation to some of the work we have done. So it just makes it interesting, I think, for everyone. So we would encourage you to please do that. It might take you, I don't know, how long? 20 minutes, yeah, I would say. So,
Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you very